Maryland. He wore the green of the Boston Celtics from 1987 to 1993, and according to major sports media reports, he suffered sudden cardiac passing on July 27, 1993, during an off-season workout at Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts. He was 27 years old. This is not a story about scandal. There's no disgrace at the heart of it, no fall from grace, no headline that ruined him. This is a story about a quiet man who was handed a loud burden. He was supposed to be the bridge, the player who carried one of the proudest franchises in basketball from the end of a golden era into whatever came next. Smooth on the court, respected in the locker room. The kind of guy teammates trusted without him ever raising his voice. And his story ended mid-sentence. That's the part that haunts people who lived through it. You can debate whether a guy reached his ceiling. You can argue about legacy. But with Reggie Lewis, nobody got to find out. The question mark never got resolved. Before he ever wore Celtic green, Reggie Lewis came out of one of the most loaded high school gyms in American history, a place that produced 4 future pros at the same time. To understand Reggie Lewis, you have to start in Baltimore, at Dunbar High School, in a gym that may have held more raw basketball talent than any high school program the sport has ever seen. This wasn't a one-star team with a supporting cast. Lewis played alongside Muggsy Bogues, Reggie Williams, and David Wingate, 3 more future NBA players, all sharing the same hardwood, all coming up together. Think about that for a second. 4 guys who would go on to the league, all on one roster, all trying to find their place at the same time. And they didn't just win, they dominated. According to Basketball Archives, the Dunbar Poets went 29-0 in Lewis's junior year and then 31-0 in his senior year. 2 seasons, not a single loss. Major sports media reports, including USA Today, ranked Dunbar number 1 in the entire nation during that stretch. Now, when you're surrounded by that much talent, you learn something about yourself fast. You learn to fit in. You learn to share. You learn that the scoreboard matters more than your own numbers. For a lot of teenagers, that's a hard lesson. For Reggie Lewis, it became who he was. Quiet, team first, willing to do whatever the night required and never demand the spotlight. That environment shaped a player who could disappear inside a game and still shape the outcome of it. But there's a flip side to growing up in a room full of stars. A player surrounded by that many stars often gets overlooked, and when college recruiters came calling, Lewis ended up somewhere far quieter than you'd expect. The big programs chased the bigger names, and so Reggie Lewis, the quiet one from that loaded Dunbar team, ended up at Northeastern University, a long way from the bright lights and national television games that follow the powerhouse schools. But here's where the story turns. The kid who'd spent his whole life sharing the ball, blending in, deferring to the stars around him, suddenly didn't have to blend in anymore. At Northeastern, the offense could run through him. And what happened next told you everything about how much had been hiding in plain sight. According to Basketball Archives, Lewis scored 2,708 points over 4 years at Northeastern. To this day, that's still the all-time scoring record at the school. Decades later, nobody has caught him. That's the contradiction that defined his whole game. He was smooth. He was unselfish. He looked like a complementary piece, a guy who'd happily play within the system. And yet, when you handed him the keys, he could carry an entire offense on his back, night after night, season after season. Both things were true at once. That's rare. By the time the 1987 NBA draft rolled around, the scouts had taken notice. According to Basketball Archives, the Boston Celtics selected Reggie Lewis 22nd overall, late first round, not a headline pick, the kind of selection that doesn't make front pages. He was walking into a championship locker room, But he was also walking into the shadow of a tragedy that had already shaken the franchise to its core just 1 year earlier. In the late 1980s, the Boston Celtics were still one of the most feared names in basketball. But the foundation underneath them was getting old, and everybody in the league knew it. The Big Three, Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, and Robert Parrish, had given Boston championships and a decade of dominance. But the legs don't last forever. The minutes pile up. The clock starts ticking loud enough that even a proud organization can't ignore it. The Celtics needed youth. They needed someone to carry the future, and they needed it badly. That need wasn't just about basketball math. It was wrapped in heartbreak. According to Basketball Archives, Lynn Bias, the player Boston took second overall in the 1986 draft, passed away from a controlled substance medical emergency before he ever played a single NBA game. He was supposed to be the answer, the young star who'd keep the dynasty alive. And in an instant, he was gone, leaving a wound the franchise was still carrying when Reggie Lewis arrived. So Lewis stepped into a complicated situation, a team chasing a future it was afraid to talk about out loud, a locker room of legends, and the quiet ghost of a kid who never got his chance. At first, Lewis didn't look like any kind of rescue. According to Basketball Archives, in his rookie 1987-88 season, he played sporadically and averaged just 4.5 points per game, buried on the bench, easy to forget. Almost nobody expected the quiet rookie buried on the bench to nearly quadruple his scoring in a single year, but that's exactly what happened next. There's a difference between a player who's struggling and a player who's just waiting. From the outside, those two things look exactly the same. Reggie Lewis, in that quiet rookie year, looked like a guy who might not make it. Inside, he was the second kind. He was waiting. And when his chance came, the leap was almost hard to believe. According to Basketball Archives, Lewis jumped from 4.5 points per game as a rookie to 18.5 points per game in his second season, 1988-89. That's not improvement, that's a transformation. You don't quadruple your scoring by accident. You do it because the talent was always there, and the opportunity finally caught up to it. What changed? More minutes, more trust, more room to be the player he'd been at Northeastern, the one who could carry a load when the team needed it. The quiet kid who'd spent years deferring to stars was now becoming one himself, right inside the most storied franchise in the league. And he had the moments to prove it wasn't a fluke. According to Basketball Archives, in 1991, Lewis scored a career-high 42 points against the Miami Heat. 42. That's not a role player having a good night. That's a scorer announcing himself, telling the whole league exactly what he was capable of when the floor opened up. By the early 1990s, Lewis wasn't just a useful piece anymore, and the league was about to put his name on a stage reserved for stars. By the start of the 1990s, Reggie Lewis had stopped being a question and started being an answer. The guy who once couldn't crack the rotation was now the player opposing coaches game planned around, and the numbers backed it up in a way nobody could argue with. In both the 1991-92 season and the 1992-93 season, Lewis averaged 20.8 points per game, back-to-back. That's not a hot stretch or a lucky run. That's a player who had arrived and planted his feet, telling everybody this was who he was now. And the league noticed. In the 1991-92 season, Lewis earned a spot in the NBA All-Star Game, held that year in Orlando. It was the first selection of his career. Quietly, almost the way he did everything, the kid from Dunbar who'd spent his whole life sharing the spotlight had finally stepped into the middle of it. An all-star in Boston green. Then came the moment that changed the shape of his career. Larry Bird, one of the greatest players the game ever produced, walked away from basketball in 1992. And when the dust settled, the Celtics named Reggie Lewis their team captain. Think about what that meant. Bird had been the heartbeat of the franchise, the face of an era. Now the green and white was handing that armband to a soft-spoken 26-year-old. Not a loud leader, not a guy who gave speeches. Lewis led the way he played, by showing up, by doing the work, by carrying the load and never asking for credit. But leading the Celtics is not a quiet job. It comes with the weight of every banner hanging in that building, every legend who came before. And he accepted it. He looked like a player still climbing. Better numbers, bigger role, brighter future. Which is exactly why what happened in a 1993 playoff game felt so impossible to process. April 29, 1993. Game 1 of the Celtics playoff series against the Charlotte Hornets. The kind of night Reggie Lewis was built for. Playoff basketball, the franchise on his shoulders, a chance to prove that captaincy was in the right hands. And then, on the floor, in front of everyone, he went down. According to major sports media reports, Lewis collapsed on the court and stayed down for several seconds. When he got back to his feet, he looked confused, dazed, perplexed, like a man trying to figure out where he was and what had just happened. People in the building saw it. Cameras caught it. Nobody quite knew what they were looking at. He came back into the game. That was Reggie. He wanted to play, wanted to push through it. But it didn't last. He was pulled because of dizziness and shortness of breath, the kind of symptoms you can't talk your way past. When the night was over, he'd finished with 17 points in just 13 minutes. Even collapsing, even short of breath, the man could score. Here's the part that still sits heavy with anyone who watched it. Nobody in that arena knew what they were really seeing. To them, it was a scary moment. A player who'd taken a fall, maybe dehydration, maybe something that a day of rest would fix. They figured he'd be back. But that game was the final NBA appearance of Reggie Lewis's career, the last time he'd ever play. A 6-year run that carried a 17.6 points per game average ended right there, on a playoff floor, with a collapse nobody understood yet. The next morning, he checked into a hospital, and the answer the doctors gave him would set off one of the most painful disagreements in sports medicine history. The day after the collapse, on April 30th, 1993, Reggie Lewis checked into New England Baptist Hospital. And what gathered around him was unlike anything most patients ever see. Major sports media reports describe more than a dozen specialists assembled to figure out what had happened on that court. The Celtics called them their dream team of doctors, the best people money and reputation could put in one room, all focused on one 27-year-old heart. When their work was done, the diagnosis they delivered was grim: focal cardiomyopathy, a disease of the heart muscle. According to public medical and news records, it's the kind of condition that can trigger an irregular heartbeat and, in the worst cases, heart failure. This was not a pulled muscle or a bad day. This was the heart itself. And then came the sentence no athlete in his prime ever wants to hear. Lewis was told his condition was most likely career-ending, most likely done. The captain's armband, the all-star berth, the 20-point seasons, the future everyone had projected for him. A room full of specialists was telling him it might all be over. Sit with that for a second. He was 27. He just inherited a dynasty's expectations. He was supposed to be the bridge to whatever came next for Boston. And now the message coming back from the experts was that the basketball part of his life might already be behind him. For most people, that's where the story stalls. You hear it from a room full of doctors, you accept it. But a player that young, that talented, was not going to accept a passing sentence on his career without a second opinion. And that second opinion told him something very different. Hope is a powerful thing. When a room full of specialists tells a 27-year-old his career is finished, The most human response in the world is to ask whether they might be wrong. Reggie Lewis went looking for another answer. He found his way to Dr. Gilbert Mudge at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and Mudge's read on the situation was far less severe than what the Dream Team had delivered. According to major sports media reports, Mudge diagnosed neurocardiogenic syncope, a condition tied to fainting, not the kind of dangerous heart muscle disease the first group had described. On the basis of that opinion, Lewis began working toward a return to the Celtics for the 1994 season. And right there sits the conflict that has haunted this story ever since. Two respected hospitals, two sets of doctors, two diagnoses that pointed in opposite directions. One young man with everything to lose, standing in the middle, trying to decide which set of experts to believe. Now, this part demands care because people have argued about it for decades, and it's still painful. Dr. Mudge was later cleared of any wrongdoing, and he maintained firmly that he had never authorized Lewis to resume workouts. That's an important detail. The picture that sometimes gets painted of a doctor sending a sick man back onto the court is not the version the record supports. What's left is something murkier and sadder than blame. A talented young captain, desperate to play the game he loved, caught between competing medical opinions, leaning toward the one that gave him hope. You can understand every choice in that chain and still feel your stomach drop at where it was heading. Encouraged by hope and a hometown's expectations, Lewis went back to the gym that summer, and on a quiet July afternoon, the disagreement no longer mattered. It was an off-season workout, nothing dramatic on the schedule, just a player keeping his body ready, doing the thing he'd done 10,000 times before, on a basketball court at Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts. And then, on July 27, 1993, Reggie Lewis suffered sudden cardiac passing. He was 27 years old. According to public records and major sports media reports, two Brandeis University police officers found him and tried to bring him back, attempting resuscitation right there on the court. They did everything they could. It wasn't enough. The captain of the Boston Celtics was gone on a quiet summer day, far from any arena, with no crowd and no cameras. Just a gym, a heart that had finally given out, and two officers fighting to save a life that couldn't be saved. The official cause cut straight to the question that had divided those doctors. His passing was attributed to hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a structural defect of the heart, and the most common cause of sudden passing in young athletes. The very kind of danger the first group of specialists had warned about. The competing opinions, the second chance, the workouts toward a comeback, all of it collapsed into one terrible morning. He never got his return. He never got the chance to lead Boston into its next era the way everyone imagined. The bridge from one generation of Celtics to the next simply ended mid-construction, with a young man face down on a practice floor and no way to undo it. A city that had just lost a young captain now had to grieve him publicly, and the way Boston said goodbye told you everything about who Reggie Lewis was. On August 2nd, 1993, just days after the worst news Boston could imagine, the city gathered to say goodbye. The funeral drew the people who knew him, and the people who only knew his game, all of them carrying the same disbelief. How do you bury a 27-year-old captain? How do you find the words for a young man who was supposed to have decades ahead of him? What made the grief so heavy was what Reggie Lewis represented. There was no scandal to wrestle with, no ugly headline to complicate the mourning. He was, by every account, a quiet leader, a respected teammate, a family man who carried himself with a kind of dignity that didn't need a microphone. People weren't grieving a cautionary tale. They were grieving a good man and an exceptional player, taken before anyone was ready. and the basketball he left behind only sharpened the loss. Over 42 playoff games, Lewis averaged 17.5 a night. In the 1992 postseason alone, he poured in 28 a game, the kind of run that hints at a player still rising, still finding new ceilings. That was the cruelty of it. The evidence said his best was in front of him, and now there would be no more chapters. For longtime Celtics fans, there was something almost eerie about the moment, because this was the second time in 7 years the franchise had buried a young future. First, Len Bias, gone before he ever played a regular season minute. Now, Reggie Lewis, gone in the middle of his prime. Two bright tomorrows, both erased, both leaving the same hollow question hanging over the city. It felt less like bad luck and more like a wound that refused to close. But the story didn't end with the funeral, because his passing exposed a strange gap in NBA rules that left his name on the team's books long after he was gone. Grief is one thing, paperwork is another. And in the months after Reggie Lewis passed, the Boston front office ran into a problem that nobody in the league had ever truly planned for. His contract didn't disappear. According to public documents and major sports reporting, Lewis's deal stayed on the team's salary cap for 2 full seasons after his passing. 2 years. The league simply had no provision on the books to void a contract when an active player passed away. Nobody had written that rule because nobody had imagined needing it. The math kept counting a man who was no longer there. Think about what that meant in practical terms. While other teams could chase free agents and rebuild, Boston was carrying the salary of a player it could never put on the floor again. The captain's number kept weighing on the books like a ghost in the ledger. The league knew how strange it looked. Commissioner David Stern stepped in and asked the other franchises to approve an exemption, a way to lift that financial burden off the Celtics, given the extraordinary circumstances. It was a reasonable ask, born from a situation no one had ever faced. And the other teams refused. They voted it down. Boston would carry the cost. You can read that 2 ways. Cold business, or simply a league bound by rules it hadn't thought to update. But either way, it told you something about how rare this tragedy was. The NBA had procedures for trades, for injuries, for retirements, for nearly everything. It had nothing for this. The rule book had never been written to handle a captain dying in his prime, and so the system did the only thing it knew how to do. It kept counting. While the front office fought over numbers, the Celtics were preparing a far more permanent gesture, one that would hang in the rafters forever. On March 22, 1995, the Boston Celtics did something they reserved for the legends. They raised Reggie Lewis's number 35 to the rafters, retiring it for good. The number he had worn from his first day in green to his last, across all 6 seasons of his career, would never be worn by another Celtic again. Now stop and sit with what that means. Boston is a franchise drowning in banners and retired numbers. The bar to get your jersey lifted into that building is brutally high. It's a club of champions and immortals. And Reggie Lewis played just 6 seasons, 1 All-Star appearance, a career cut off before he ever won a ring of his own. By the usual measuring sticks, that's a short resume for such a permanent honor. But that's exactly the point. The Celtics weren't only measuring statistics. They were honoring what he meant. The quiet captain who'd inherited a dynasty's weight and carried it without complaint. The man teammates trusted. The player whose best years were stolen rather than spent. Raising that number was a city's way of refusing to let a quiet man be forgotten. Reggie Lewis never demanded attention in life. He led by showing up and doing the work. So Boston made sure that the spotlight he never chased would shine on him forever, every single night, hanging above the floor where he once played. As long as that arena stands, no one can pretend he wasn't there. But beneath the honors and the tributes lay a harder set of questions about diagnoses, decisions, and disputes that some people are still arguing about today. Every era of basketball has its what-ifs, the injury that changed everything, the trade that never happened. But few of them cut as deep as Reggie Lewis, because his question mark isn't about a missed shot or a bad bounce. It's about a life, and how much of it was left unlived. What if the first set of specialists had been heeded without challenge? What if the second opinion had pointed the same direction as the first? What if a workout that summer had simply never taken place? Those questions have circled this story for 3 decades, and the honest answer is that no one can resolve them. 2 respected hospitals reached 2 different conclusions about one young heart. Dr. Mudge was later cleared of any wrongdoing and held firm that he never authorized a return to the gym. The picture isn't one of villains, it's one of competing judgments, terrible uncertainty, and a young man leaning toward the answer that let him keep dreaming. What we can say is that his passing didn't pass without changing things. The sudden loss of a healthy-looking 27-year-old athlete forced uncomfortable conversations about cardiac screening for young players, about what teams test for, what they watch for, and how hidden a structural heart defect can be even in someone in peak condition. The lessons came at an unbearable price, but they came. And in the end, the numbers and the disputes aren't what people hold on to. They hold on to the man. A kid from a legendary Baltimore gym who